This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
So I thought I would end by saying a few words about obesity, both from a public health standpoint as well as clinical care. One of my hobbies at UCSF is I did start a weight management program back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, again, as I sort of told you half my story, the second half of the story was when I joined the faculty and started my primary care practice and teaching primary care. I was always looking for that interface between nutrition and internal medicine and primary care practice, and early on realized that the work was not in the hospital, but the work was in the clinic and the community. So we did start a small weight management program. It's still going on. We have a terrific team of physicians and dietitians and psychologists who work with us. We're happy to see any of your patients at that site. So just, you've heard the basic numbers before. About a third of Americans are defined as obese. 2/3 are defined as overweight. There are some gender differences. Obesity in this definition is defined primarily, or exclusively by the body mass index, which is your weight divided by your height squared in the metric system. Why do we use the body mass index? Because as a surrogate measure of two easily measured things, your height and weight, it correlates extremely well with total body fat. And remember, obesity is an excess of fat, it's not an excess of weight. As Katie mentioned, though, there are many other factors, most particularly the location of the body fat, so all fat is not equal. And clinically, now with electronic health records and meaningful use criteria, everyone is getting a height and a weight measured. It used to be that only about half of patients who walked into the office had a height and weight measured. Now it's much more common because it's part of meaningful use criteria. But what we're still not doing is interpreting that data correctly. So patients are still not being told the results, and they're not necessarily being told correctly what it all means. So we think of the BMI as a screening test, and like any good screening test, you then have to do a second, more specific diagnostic test to really think through, are you dealing with obesity that's an illness, or are you dealing with a high body mass index, which may or may not be related to disease? And let me go through that a little bit. So in the United States, it's about 6%. Now, depending on what you read and what data sets you're looking at, this doesn't project particularly well. But this is to demonstrate the point that although of the last 4 decades, the first 3 was associated with this marked increase in body weight in the United States, that the most recent decade, between 2000 and 2010, has not shown any further increase. So this is a little bit confusing because there's a lot of obesity out there. It's leading to an increase in diabetes, but the prevalence of obesity in the society has sort of stabilized, and that's true in adults and children on average. There are subpopulations that we'll talk about. So this just compares the distribution of body mass indexes in the 2 decades, and you can see the lines are superimposable, and there are a variety of other ways to present this data. But yes, we're in an epidemic of obesity, but the rate of increase is actually flattened. And so weights have relatively stabilized. And we don't know why that is, whether we've hit some biological cap, whether the people who are really severely overweight are dying, and so not showing up in these databases, or whether some of the public health measures and attention we've put to this is beginning to show an effect. Roughly the numbers are the same in children. The prevalence of severe obesity is now 12% in children. Obesity is defined a little bit differently in kids based on growth curves, but it's about half the rate that it is in adults. But luckily here too, it appears on average to be stabilizing, although there are pockets where it's still increasing. Now here's a trick question that the pediatricians in the room will get, but the rest of us who take care of adults might not. If severe obesity is defined as being above the 97th percentile in weight, how can the incidence be anything other than 3%? Right? Took me a while to figure this out as an adult physician. And the answer is because this is the 97th percentile of the standards from the 1960s and 70s. So it's a trick question if some of you were bothered by that number. And these are the prevalence data from the CDC in children, so generally flat, but with some pockets of increase in Latino children and African American children. There are tremendous health disparities in obesity. Again, I've just cherry-picked two particular groups to highlight this, but you can go through any age and demographic, age and gender subset and find these disparities. But looking, for example, in middle-aged women, much higher prevalence of obesity in blacks and Latinos compared to whites, and same in teenagers. And of course, one of the hidden epidemics of obesity is in the mentally ill, where the prevalence, instead of being 65%, is 83%. Some of that is due to socioeconomic factors and housing and food insecurity and things like that. But some of it is also related to the medications we use to treat severe obesity, which are associated with weight gain. And of course, there are tremendous regional and geographic disparities. The darker colors here, this burnt red, is the highest rate of obesity in any by state. And so you can see the Southeast has been, if you will, a hotspot, no pun intended, for obesity in the United States for decades. Of course, there are many others. You could change the word obesity here to many, many, many other demographic factors where there is also a prevalence of increase in the Southeast, poverty, for example, and food insecurity, and many, many other factors. But obesity is particularly severe in the Southeast. Colorado has the least obesity, and California also does relatively well, although, as you know, California is not really one state, it's many, many states, and depending on which part of the state you slice, the rates are actually quite high in parts of the Central Valley and so forth. All right, here's a thought exercise. We don't have our clickers, but this is sort of fun. For a 40-year-old woman with normal metabolic blood tests, along the lines of what Katie was suggesting, blood sugar, blood pressure, blood lipids, in good health, which body mass index is associated with the lowest all-cause mortality? In other words, at what weight would we predict she would be likely to live the longest? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's vote. All right. We'll do a vote. I was going to do this as a thought exercise, but I can see you're into it, so let's do it. All right. So it's 18, 24, 28, 34, and 38, and I've defined them for you. So just to be precise, well, I won't be precise. The number it says what it says. So all in favor of 18. So it can't be too thin or too rich. 24. Right, that makes sense, right? Normal is normal. Over 28? Ooh, some people think that being a little chunky is the healthiest weight. Obese class 1, we divide obesity in class 1, class 2, and class 3, 30 to 35, 35 to 40, over 40. Class 1, and no one thinks class 2. All right, good. So let's look at the data, and some of you are right, but not all of you. So here are the definitions. Less than 8, and it reflects the last slide, so less than 18.5 is underweight, normal is 18.5 to 25, then overweight is this category 25 to 30, and then the 3 stages of obesity. But again, remember, this is based upon a single measurement, the body mass index, which is your weight divided by your height squared, a reflection of total body fat, and that is not the disease. The disease are strokes and heart disease and diabetes and kidney disease and so forth. Those are the diseases. So I skipped over the issue of, is obesity a disease? And sometimes obesity is a disease, and sometimes obesity is a risk factor for disease, and that's why we have these debates about that. So here's the data that raises some interesting questions, and this was the first study that raised this, but there have now been over a dozen. So it's a lot of information here. So just focus on this column here just for the sake of the first slide, the first moment. So it breaks down long-term life expectancy as a function of body mass index. And this, what was good about the study, it was done by the CDC and reflected, and Haynes is this governmentally run health and nutrition survey that's done every 5 to 10 years. And what they did was combine the data from 3 different versions of the study. So it was a big, big data set over about a 15 to 20 year period. And they used as the frame of reference the normal body weight, and then compared the underweight and overweight to this. So the first thing you see is that the people who are too thin, or who are thin, underweight, die 38% more often. And that's mostly due to cigarettes. So even if you take out the people who die the first year, so some people who have hidden illness, there's still an increase, and the increase is associated with cigarette use. If you take out cigarettes, this number approaches 1. So being too thin is not a risk factor as long as you're not ill, either with any kind of illness, including mental illness, and if you don't smoke. We know that obesity is associated with increased risk, but it wasn't 4 times greater, it was double. And that's, in 10, 20 years ago, this number might have been 4. So the amount of excess mortality from obesity seems to be decreasing. Not the amount of obesity, but the attributable risk from obesity. And we think that's probably because we're much better now at treating obesity-related complications, particularly lipids and blood pressure. So the use of statins and blood pressure medications in the obese has decreased the excess mortality in that cohort. But here's the most interesting number. So that the people who are overweight did not have any excess mortality. And so what we've been saying for years is that there's no longer something called an ideal body weight. Some of you are old enough to remember the metropolitan life curves and frame sizes and things like that. So we go away from saying there's a specific weight that everyone should be. Rather, we think of a range of acceptable weights. And what this data would suggest is that that range of acceptable weights maybe should be wider. Again, no pun intended. That you can be anywhere from 18 to maybe 30 and not have a lot of excess mortality. It's also worth noting that in your 8th decade, obesity is no longer a risk factor at all. So as people get older, weight is more dangerous to be underweight and frail than it is to be a little overweight. I think I have to show it to explain the answer. So then there was another study. This was a meta-analysis of 100 studies of over almost 3 million people. And just to really confuse things, not only did they confirm that finding, that overweight was not associated with increased risk compared to so-called normal weight, but overweight was only slightly increased risk. And then when you broke down overweight, those that were in 30 to 35, so now technically obese, but just a little obese, were doing fine too. And then most of the excess risk came from grade 2 and grade 3 obesity. So this is not proof. This is observational. This is hypothesis generating kind of data. But it certainly suggests that people in the overweight category, just by definition, are not necessarily at risk unless they are. So the take-home message is that if someone's in the overweight category, you need to evaluate them metabolically and see if they have a BMI with metabolic abnormalities or a BMI without metabolic abnormalities and other risks. Of course, you would also do that in people of normal weight because, as Katie mentioned, there are many people with normal body mass index who still have lipid disorders, diabetes, blood sugar disorders, and the like. So the provocative correct answer is all three of these, although I think this is really still a hypothesis. But it certainly suggests that maybe we should redefine our definition of normal to include being a little overweight, as long as you're otherwise metabolically normal and fit. And so we'll talk about that next. Okay, take a minute to look at this cartoon. It takes a while to figure out what's happening. So I think the other slide I showed said 50%, but about 60% of people in the United States don't exercise regularly, and 25% of people hardly do anything. So one myth is that exercise is really important for weight loss, and that's a myth. The truth is that this is the only bad thing I'm going to say about exercise, but I'm a truth teller. Exercise is ineffective at short-term weight loss. Now, it's terrific for other things that I'll come to in a minute. But if you look at the randomized trials, again, large number of randomized trials, and compare people who exercise, go on a weight loss diet, and it can be any one of several types of low-calorie balance, whatever, low-carb, it doesn't matter, diets, and then add exercise to the diet in one group in a randomized way and not to the other group, the amount of excess weight lost in the exercise group is quite trivial. There's a little bit of a dose effect if you exercise a lot, and you've all seen the TV shows where people really, really exercise a lot. And sure enough, if you exercise all day, you can lose some weight. But these are typically the way we prescribe exercise, which would be 30 to 60 minutes of moderate exercise most days of the week. I'll come back to that. But at that dose, the amount of weight that's lost as part of a weight loss program is quite modest. Now, everything else gets better. So there's no question that metabolically exercise is good for your blood sugar, blood pressure, lipids, and so forth. But in terms of weight loss, and anyone who's ever been on an exercise machine, and you're on that stair climber or elliptical for 40 minutes, and then it says I just burned 300 calories, and then I just had my muffin for 1,200. It doesn't work. So, but it doesn't. Now, that's the only bad thing I'm going to say about exercise, because exercise is good for everything else. But it is important to know that to lose weight, you have to eat less calories, and it has to be about a quarter less than you're eating now, as I discussed earlier. If you want to lose a pound a week, if you eat 12% less than you normally eat, you lose half a pound a week. So this is this sort of study that we also referred to earlier about fitness trumping fatness. So this comes from the Aerobic Center, the Cooper Institute in Texas, but there have been many, many other data sets that have showed the same thing. And again, a lot of numbers here. Let me just focus you on the bottom here, which is again looking at mortality, which is our hardest endpoint. And what they did was they took a bunch of people who were normal body weight, body mass index under 25, and used them as the reference point. And then they put people on a treadmill and measured oxygen production and so forth, fairly sophisticated measures of fitness. And those that were fit and normal body weight were used as the comparison group. So if you are on the treadmill, and even though you're normal body weight, if you can't exercise, your risk of dying in the next decade is double. So we've known this for a long time. Sedentary lifestyle is an important risk factor of premature mortality and also cardiovascular mortality. Old news, but this demonstrates that. We also know that if you're obese, most people who are obese are not fit, and they also don't do as well. In this case, 3 times risk of premature mortality in a decade. But here's the magic corner. All right, so the people whose body mass index was over 30, who were fit, did just fine. And again, up here, not quite as perfect, but again, same idea that this group was doing well. Now, what this study suggested, if you take it one step further, is that this corner here, the people who were obese and fit, not only did better than the people who are obese and not fit, and that's true in every study, but in this study, the people who are obese and fit even did better than the thin people who were not fit. So this is where the phrase fitness trumps fatness comes from. Now, not every study shows that this is better than this, but every study does show that this is better than this. So what that suggests is that the goal number one related to obesity has nothing to do with weight at all. It has to do with fitness. So one of my number one rules of thumb is be as fit as you can be at the weight you're at. And we'll come to that at the end. This is a similar study that shows the same thing. So that's all I'm going to say about exercise in this context. Except, actually, that's not true. There's one more thing I'm going to say in a minute. So just a few words about diets, and I think I'm going to go through this quickly. I think we touched on most of these points, and I won't dwell on the point, but for many, many years, and I made my Johnny Carson joke earlier, but for many years there have been debates about low carb versus high carb and so forth. And there are now about 24 studies that have randomized people to one of these diets. So Atkins versus Ornish, or Atkins versus Zone, or in this particular study it was all 4 of them. And the bottom line is that in none of these diets do people lose a lot of weight. In all of these diets, there's a high dropout rate. That people who stay on the diet do better than people who don't stay on the diet, duh. And that there was no difference based on diet type. The predictor was adherence. So if you start a diet and your goal is short-term weight loss, if you stick on that diet, and there are only a few out there that to which this doesn't apply, but it can be any of the diets we've talked about so far, the new Atkins, which is much better than the old Atkins, or South Beach, or the Zone, or Weight Watchers, or a vegan diet, or a vegetarian, or a pesco-vegetarian, or whatever you want to do. As long as you stick to it, and eat less calories than we estimate you need, you'll lose weight. It's also worth noting that these numbers that I just showed on the last slide are averages, but around each average there's a Gaussian distribution of response, which means some people do worse and gain weight even though they're on a diet, but some people do better. And so there's always a tail, if you will, of people who lose a lot more weight. So the idea to say that diets don't work is just not true. I mean, diets do what diets do. That diets are there. First of all, everything we eat is a diet. So, but a weight loss diet, a short-term weight loss diet, can be effective for short-term weight loss. Now, it's not effective for long-term weight loss, but it's a short-term weight loss diet. So you can also use more aggressive calorie restriction. There are things out there called very low calorie diets. We do this at UCSF. We put people on 800 calories a day or 1,000 calories a day instead of 1,500 calories a day. And they lose twice as much weight. So on an average diet, in general, people lose between 7 to 10% of their starting body weight. I always think of it as 7.5. This particular study shows 9, but it's between 5 and 10%. So if you weigh 200 pounds and you go on a diet for 6 months, you'll lose about 15 pounds. So it's really important for people to know that, because if they're 300 pounds and they go on a diet for 6 months, they're going to lose 20 pounds. And that probably wasn't what they had in mind. And so it's important to understand the numbers. But very low calorie diets do twice as well in the short term, but not any better in the long term. So we use this option for people who need to lose a lot of weight quick. So we have patients on very high doses of insulin, for example, who can get off insulin this way with type 2 diabetes, or if someone is preparing for bariatric surgery and needs to lose 100 pounds, or someone's having their knees replaced, or can't get it on a transplant list because they're overweight, this is a tactic that's available. But it works for short-term weight loss, but it can be done safely. So my conclusions on diets are sort of similar to what we said before. In my opinion, the type of diet does not really matter for weight loss. Again, that doesn't matter that I'm advocating a junk food weight loss diet. I'm advocating the things I was still advocating the things I was advocating this morning. But you have some macronutrient flexibility amongst the healthy foods as long as you're under your calorie intake. Sticking the diet does matter. Calories trump macronutrients, and select healthy nutrient-rich foods to achieve that lower calorie intake. I think so some weight loss diet tips. If this is true for yourself as well as your patients. We talk a lot about motivational interviewing and stages of change and trying to assess whether patients are ready to lose weight, set realistic expectations along the lines of what we can predict. Choose a diet that's easy to follow and compatible with the lifestyle. And Katie showed some of the culturally competent dietary options that are available. You focus on portion size. The plate method is a good way to do that. And other techniques for teaching people portion sizes, again, and same principles that we talked about. Now, one of the things I talk about with patients right from the beginning, though, is that maintaining the weight you lose is key. So if you're on a weight loss program and you want to lose weight, but don't have a strategy for keeping it off once you lose it, why bother? So I jokingly tell the story of a guy from the San Francisco Chronicle interviewed me, and we were going through a whole bunch of diet books and stuff, and he said, "Well, Dr. Barron, what's your diet?" It was before I had come up with the generic diet, which is of course no diet. But I was just sitting there thinking. So I said, my diet's the forever diet. That is to say, when you make the commitment to lose weight, the diet you need to lose weight at the beginning has to be the same diet that you're going to use to keep the weight off forever. And I'll show you some numbers to produce that. Unfortunately, I never wrote that book. No one would have bought it anyway because everyone wants the tomorrow diet, not the forever diet. But I'm still thinking about it. Fed up with how her diet is going, Charlene takes a more serious aim at her target weight. All right, I do have to show you this one. All right, so a 40-year-old woman, class 2 obesity, body mass index is 36. Much to your surprise and satisfaction, she's lost 35 pounds. In order to maintain her new weight, her lifelong daily calorie intake should be. And let's assume in this case that she, at the beginning, before you met her, needed about 2,000 calories to maintain her body weight. And so the question is, now that she's lost some weight, she wants to go back to her original diet, what number should she go back to? What calorie intake will you prescribe for her? 2,000, 1,800, 1,600, 1,400, 1,200, all right? We can vote. All in favor of 2,000? That was her starting weight, so back to baseline, good. 1,800, good. People beginning to think that maybe she needs less. 1,600, so that's the majority opinion. 1,400, no takers. 1,200, no takers. All right, so none of you are right. All right, so a lot of this data comes from something called the National Weight Control Registry, which is a collection of patients who have lost weight and kept it off. It's run out of Colorado. To get in, you needed to have lost 30 pounds and kept it off for a year. But actually, these people have lost double that and kept it off for much longer. It's mostly a Caucasian, Colorado cohort, mostly women, mostly Caucasian. So some limitations on generalizability. Some of them were overweight as a child, though, and some of them had a family history of obesity, making the point that early onset obesity and family history obesity is not a destiny to prove that you can never lose weight. Clearly, some of obesity is genetic, but you can still lose weight. And here are some of the things they do. There's a lot of different things they do. But here are the three most important. Number one, they exercise a ton. Number two, they eat a diet low in calories. And number three, they monitor their weight. So exercise a ton, an hour of moderate intensity per day. And so ironically, when you read federal recommendations to say to prevent weight gain, you need to exercise an hour a day, this is actually the data from whence that recommendation comes. So a bit of a leap to recommend for the public at large an hour a day when in fact, that's what this cohort of women are doing, but nonetheless, this is what this cohort of women is doing. So it's an hour a day, moderate intensity, if you're doing, which is brisk walking, 3 to 4 miles per hour kind of walking. And I should have said earlier, my definition of fitness, akin to that other study, is if you can walk 3 to 4 miles an hour, talk while you're doing it, do it for an hour, and wake up the next day and the day after that and the day after that and do it again and again. That's the definition of fitness in that other study. And also for good practice. So they exercise. When you figure out how many calories a day this works out to be, a week, it's about 25 or 3,000 calories per week. And almost all of them exercise. So an hour a day, what I usually say to patients is, that exercise should be biblical, 6 days a week of exercise, 1 day of rest. Again, I'm flexible what day of the week that rest day is. All denominations are fine. And if patients want to exercise 7 days a week, that's also okay as long as they can do it without overuse injuries. So you have to work on different muscle groups and so forth. Remember, we talk about exercise, we mostly talk about cardiovascular exercise, but resistance training has a role. And there are two other components of fitness. So there's cardiovascular and strength, but there's also balance and flexibility. So remember, as you're working on your fitness, to also include those, especially as you get older. So not too much of a surprise here, except that the dose is higher than most people expect. And the other thing I'll say is that, at least for most adult patients and working people raising families, I think by far and away the best thing is to exercise early in the morning. If you wait till later in the day, you're tired, there's always a reason not to do it. So I always tell patients, never go to bed today without knowing when you're going to exercise tomorrow. And most of the time that means just back calculating your day. You know when you have to be somewhere. So I had to be here at 7:30. So I knew it was taking a half an hour to get here, and I had to back calculate when I had to get up in order to get my exercise in before I came. So that way it's done. I don't have to worry about it today. I can have a glass of wine at 5, and I don't have to exercise. So do it early in the morning. All right, here's the other take-home point. These women eat 1,400 calories a day. So they needed 2,000 to break even. They got smaller. Their body metabolically slowed down. Their energy metabolism decreased. And in order to maintain their body weight, it's 1,400 calories a day. Now, again, a Gaussian distribution around this average, but it's really low. And that's where the idea of the forever diet comes from, because 1,400 calorie diets is a weight loss dose if you need 2,000. But when it gets to weight maintenance, now it's not a weight loss dose anymore, it's a weight maintenance dose. So that's where people get confused. If you go back to 2,000 or 1,800, they'll gain the weight back. Most of these people are brazers rather than bingers. They eat a small amount throughout the day, and they almost never eat fast food, and they monitor their weight carefully, either daily or weekly. So 1,400 calories is, quote, the correct answer. I'll just show you 2 slides about drugs, and then 2 or 3 slides about drugs and 2 or 3 slides about surgery. So this is the cartoon that we show to the medical students about the neuroendocrinology of energy balance or control of appetite. And as UCSF alums, you know that anytime a professor shows you a slide with this many arrows, it's because they don't have a clue as to what's going on. And basically, the take-home message here is that appetite is hard to control, that there are many factors in the control of appetite. And the take-home message is that there's a tremendous amount of biologic redundancy. Remember, we are programmed to preserve our weight. So if you inhibit one of these pathways, one of these other pathways just crank it up, right? So the idea that we're going to find a chemical to block one of these that's going to cause weight loss is highly, highly unlikely. And that's why you're beginning to see in the weight loss research realm use of combinations of drugs. So if this ever works, and I'll define what I mean by work in just a moment, if this ever works, it's going to be because of using multiple medications that are attacking this from multiple different pathways. Not unlike the way we treat cancer, not unlike the way we treat hypertension, not unlike the way we treat diabetes. It's unlikely to be the way we treat lipids. With lipids, we did find the magic bullet, we think, and it is saving lives. But with these other conditions, it takes multiple pathways. So we're not holding our breath for a single medication. And there are a lot of medications out there, and I'm not going to go through this as an old list. There are now some newer ones, but it makes the point that the average amount of weight loss is about 5% of your starting weight. And remember, I told you diets are 5 to 10%. So the amount of benefit you get from most medications is quite modest compared to a good diet and exercise program. So we don't use them. And the reason we don't use them is A, they don't work, and B, they really don't work. So, and what I mean by that is that to get these drugs approved, all you need to do is show a certain amount of weight loss or a certain number of patients that have lost a certain amount of weight. And so that's why some of these drugs, the FDA rejects them, and then there's a few new people on the panel, and the next vote, they accept the drug, and then it goes to the full panel, and they reject the drug, and the stock goes up, and the stock goes down. And it's all based on very soft data. And the FDA has gotten much stricter on this because of this study. And so sibutramine, as you know, Meridia was around for a while, and it was everyone's favorite drug. I never used it, but it was out there. And because it was associated with about 5%, 7% weight loss. And finally, they thought they were going to make a killing and use this drug as a part of diabetes therapy, right? So what they did was they randomized 10,000 patients, gave them the drug versus placebo, followed them for 3 or 4 years. So just like you would do a study for a statin, looked at combined cardiac outcomes just like you would for a statin, and basically showed that the people who got the sibutramine died 16% more than people who got the sugar pill. So sort of the same kind of experience we saw with the antioxidant vitamins, although this is a prescription drug that had been already approved by the FDA and in use by millions of people around the world because it was tested based on weight loss and not based upon the diseases that we care about. Remember, obesity is not a number. Obesity is a metabolic syndrome associated with cardiovascular disease and other complications. And this particular drug killed people with an increase of 16%. So the drug was withdrawn from the market almost immediately. And what it's done is it's made the FDA raise the bar before they accept most other new drugs. So I think that's a good thing because this is the kind of literature we know from statins, we know it from blood pressure pills, we know it from some diabetes pills. It's what we expect of the FDA, this kind of proof. And we shouldn't be using drugs just because it lowers weights a little bit. I think that's all I'll say about weights, and just a few words. I mean, drugs. Say just a few words about surgery. Al Roker's kept it off mostly. So we've done that. So here are the types of surgery. So this is interesting. There are really 2 basic ways to change the GI tract for weight loss. One, you can make the stomach smaller. That's called restrictive. Or you can create a process whereby the body does not absorb nutrients in the normal manner. So you create a malabsorption syndrome by manipulating the GI tract. The problem with this type is that the old version of this, the GI bypass, patients like this because you can eat a lot. And then you get some malabsorption, which is unpleasant, but with oily diarrhea, but whatever. That's a joke. But with the GI bypass, there were a lot of long-term metabolic side effects. So that surgery was discontinued. And many of these are not that different, and we don't have long-term data on them. So most obesity bariatric surgeons, not all, but most bariatric surgeons are using primarily restrictive procedures. The Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, which is still in the United States the most common procedure, about 60–70% of procedures, is mostly restrictive. I'll show you pictures of all these. Is mostly restrictive, but you can create a malabsorption component by making the Roux loop a little bit longer. But the primary surgeries in the United States now are Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, mostly for its restrictive elements, and sleeve gastrectomy, which is coming on strong, and adjustable gastric banding, which is diminishing in popularity. And these are some of the anatomy cartoons, just to make the point. So vertical banded gastroplasty is an older procedure, but you can see you keep the stomach in place, put in this clamp, make the stomach about 30 cc's, so the size of a surgeon's thumb, not my little thumb, but a surgeon's big thumb, about that size. The gastric band tries to do that with this elastic band, which is not permanent, but you have to have a port, and the inflating it is tricky. And then the Roux-en-Y here, where you actually separate off the stomach and create this Roux loop, so that the food, so mostly again you're experiencing this smaller pouch, so you get early satiety. Now, of course, if you drink all your calories, you can beat this. And so patients still need to understand what a good diet is pre and post operatively. And this is the sleeve gastrectomy, which is another procedure which is gaining in popularity. There's less literature on it. It's technically a little easier than the Roux-en-Y, but we don't have as much long-term data. And the different procedures are associated with different amounts of weight loss. The control is this blue line, and then the vertical banding and banding procedures are intermediate. The sleeve is probably in there as well, and then the Roux-en-Y gives the best long-term weight loss. Now there is some weight gain. So lap band was very popular. It was mostly done in Australia, New Zealand, and with very good published results. But as the surgeons here learned how to do it, the results were not as good. And in fact, several major studies basically showing that lap band results in less good outcomes compared to other procedures. So this has sort of fallen out of favor fairly dramatically. But it's easier to do, so again, there are many people out there doing it. But in big centers, it's fallen out of favor. I think this just makes the point, again, this is from where that other slide comes from. I show this slide to show that if you follow people long enough, and this was 11 years, that people do keep the weight off, but not all of it. So with the best procedures, say with gastric bypass, it's about 30% max and about 20-25% off at 11 years. So these procedures do work at lowering weight. But patients definitely need to be taught how to keep it off. So in summary, just some numbers to remember. So a regular diet, about 7.5% of your baseline weight. An extreme, very low-calorie diet is double that, so 15%. And surgery is double that, or 30%. So that's how I think about it, different gradations of weight effectiveness. And I won't go over this in great detail, except to say that everything, all the metabolic parameters get better with all of these procedures. And there's no question that anything you can do to get the weight down makes all these metabolic parameters better. That's true with surgery, but it's also true with diet. The problem, like all elective surgeries, is that there are risks. And the real challenge for a non-surgeon who's referring a patient for surgery is really trying to define the harms as well as the benefits. And it's that balancing act that makes these decisions so hard. And our surgeons and all surgeons report verbally that their results are much better than what I'm about to show you. And all I can do is show you what's been written. And so this is from the literature. This is from slightly older, 2009, but it's from the BEST group, a sort of Centers of Excellence Consortium. And the 30-day overall mortality was 0.3%. And it varied a little bit by the procedure. The laparoscopic procedures were safer than the open procedures. Part of that is selection, though. They usually have to do the open in really big patients, 500-600 pound patients. But if you look at more composite side effects, not only death, but also thromboembolic disease, the need for a repeat operation, or a prolonged hospital stay, now it's up to 4%, or 1 out of 25, and again, with some range. So again, patients just need to understand the risks. And I think the main take-home point here is that, like in everything in medicine, there are benefits and harms, even vitamins, and we talked about earlier today. And also that you want to have this done at a place that does a lot of them and does it really well. I think that's probably the most important point. If you look at Medicare data, so now we're looking at older patients in the community, the 1-year mortality, the 30-day mortality, instead of being 0.3% is 2%, and the 1-year mortality is up to 5%. So there's a wide range of experience here, and again, it's a good reason to come to a good place. Oh, and then finally, there's been a debate about whether the surgery, since everything's going in the right direction, you would think that bariatric surgery would save lives. And it was finally shown to do so. It took 11 years of follow-up. But the number needed to treat is almost 1,000. So if you need, in other words, you need to do about 800 operations a year to prolong life in one person. So, and the longer you follow, the longer that is, because there's a lot of early risks. So, again, this is not a public health cure, but I think as the operation clearly gets better, more and more people are having good results with it. So we do refer patients for it. We have an excellent team here at UCSF. The important thing is just to understand the benefits and harm discussion. This is not nothing. This is big. I think I'll stop. And then there are nutritional issues that need to be considered. We don't have time for that for now. So let me just conclude. There was a nice article in the New England Journal a month ago, 6 months ago or so, that talked, it was called Facts About Obesity. So this is just, I took their facts and just sort of give you my opinion about their facts, most of which I agree with, and just as a way to summarize. Not all of these things that I talk about, but increasingly we know that environmental changes do work. So the experience in New York and Philadelphia and LA and the school districts and the sugar taxes, we're optimistic. And we think that we've learned a tremendous amount from advocacy around tobacco control with tremendous opportunities in food and nutrition. So this is going to be a challenge, a battle for the rest of our life. But it does suggest that in terms of teaching our students and our kids and so forth, that they have to become activists here in order to make this work. Diets work, but not for long in most people, is what they said. What I said is, yes, that's true, but remember that there's always a group out there for whom they really work great. So it's about a quarter of all people really get their act together and really can change their lives. Exercise improves health independent of weight change and aid in weight maintenance. That's an enthusiastic yes. The continuation of conditions that promote weight loss promotes weight maintenance. Strong yes. For children, programs that involve parents and home promote greater weight loss. I think that's probably true, although the evidence is still developing. Provision of meals and meal replacement products promote greater weight loss. That's what I showed you. That's how we do. That's how we achieve our very low-calorie diet, but they only work in the short term. Medications can help meaningful weight loss as long as agents can be used. This is where I mostly disagree because we don't have very good data about the longer-term clinical outcomes. And I think as a community, we should demand that as the next generation or three of weight loss drugs gets developed. And surgery results in long-term weight loss and reductions of diabetes and mortality, but should be balanced with the comment that with complications in some and many, and you have to treat a lot of people to save a life. So here are my final goals. When I see a patient, whether they come to see me for weight loss or I just, as a regular doctor, see that their body mass index is elevated, this is immediately where I go in my thinking and my teaching. So the first thing I do is I change the subject. So instead of talking about weight, I talk about fitness. So goal number one, be as fit as you can possibly be at your current weight. And as the anecdote was told earlier, you can be overweight and still be quite fit. Number two, prevent further weight gain. This is a totally acceptable goal in the office or for public health for a large number of patients, since the default is to gain weight in our society, so you need a strategy to keep your weight the same. And then in some patients, if you're successful at 1 and 2, there are options for weight loss, and we discussed what some of those are. Eat less and exercise more. That's the most ridiculous fad diet I've heard of yet. But been talking about this subject for a while, but it's still the punchline. But I think now, with much more attention to the environmental and public health aspects of this, I think we really have a chance to turn this one around. So thank you very much for your hard work on this and your attention.